All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining. This is the next installment in our USRSC Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, or DEI speaker series. Today, we are very thankful and and happy to welcome Alexander Sarah-Brennick. He is a full professor of social software engineering at the Software Engineering and Technology Cluster of the Eindhoven University of Technology. His research goal is to facilitate the evolution of software by taking into account social aspects of software development. His work tends to involve theories and methods, both from computer science, like the theory of socio-technical coordination, methods from natural language processing, etc., and from outside of computer science, like organizational psychology. The underlying idea of his work is that of empiricism, i.e., that addressing software engineering challenges should be grounded in observation and experimentation and requires a combination of social and technical perspectives. Alexander has co-authored a book, Evolving Software Systems, and more than 100 scientific scientific papers and articles. And having read a fair number of them, can confirm they are all lovely and fabulous. All right, reminder that this is recorded. We will post it later on our USRSC YouTube channel. And questions, Alexander leaves it up to us if we want to ask them throughout or at the end. So basically, if you have a question, either please post it in the chat or raise your hand at any point during the presentation, and we will let Alex know that you have a question. So go ahead, Alexander, over to you.
Thank you very much, Miranda, for inviting me. I also see Dan Katzman in the audience. It was a pleasure for me to talk briefly about our work during the workshop in Leiden that Dan also has attended. And that's essentially one of the inspirations for this conversation and for this presentation. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk about gender and community smells and broader. When you are thinking about software development, of course, we can see it as a collaborative process, right? So we have people working together towards a shared goal. And in a way, this is not so different from the harvest we see here on the etching of Nicholas Peterson Bergham. We see people of different ages, people of different genders, working together towards a common goal. We actually even see dogs. So essentially, software development is also a collaborative effort, people of different genders, people of different ages, less sure about dogs, but they're all working towards the same goal. So playing the devil's advocate, why would we care about communication? The reason why we care about communication is because, of course, it's an important coordination mechanism, right? So we have this collaborative process. Obviously, for this process to be successful, developers somehow need to coordinate their effort because they tend to depend on each other. Either their components depend on each other, or they depend on each other's knowledge and skills. So they need to figure out how to coordinate their efforts, and this means that they need to communicate. Unfortunately, communication is by far not always successful. It can be broken. For instance, we might have a developer who is working in isolation and doesn't really care to communicate with their peers. Or we might have two subgroups of developers that do not communicate except through one or two of their representative members. So this kind of situations occur in practice, and they are experienced as problematic from the project management perspective. So Damian Tambouri and his co-authors have identified several of these kind of suboptimal communication patterns and called them community smells. So they have identified a whole bunch of those smells, but today we are going to talk about four. The first one is the one we have already mentioned. So we have those two subgroups, two siloed subgroups, that they do not communicate except through very limited channels, usually one or two of their members. The second smell I have also mentioned already, it's a lone wolf. So it's a situation when an unsanctioned contributor carries out their work irrespectively of their peers, of their decisions, and whatever they might expect. Two more smells on this slide are radio silence and black cloud. So radio silence is an instance of the so-called unique boundary spanner problem. Essentially, we have a community member who interposes themselves into every formal interaction across two or more sub-communities. And as such, this person can silence this entire communication. So there is very little flexibility, if at all, to introduce parallel channels circumventing this person. It's an example of the dominance over the communication. And the last smell is a black cloud. The problem with the black cloud is a problem of information overload. There is so much communication going on, and this communication is not really structured. And subsequently, participants can no longer distinguish useful communication from useless communication, signal and noise. So why are those smells actually important? So recently we have studied relations between those community smells and suboptimal source code organization patterns known in software engineering as code smells. And indeed, we have seen relations between the two. And when I'm saying we have seen, this was a study based on large-scale archival data analysis. Essentially, we looked at how multiple open source projects communicated and how their code looked like. And then we have also consulted project managers and asked them to confirm or refute some of those relations. So one of the things we have found here is that indeed, presence of lone wolves leads to spaghetti code. And in a sense, it's logical, right? Because if I'm a lone wolf, if I could not care less about how other people are going to look at my work, then I'm not going to put any effort in structuring my code to make it understandable for someone else. Because myself, I understand my code, right? I don't care what others think, but I understand my code. And this leads to spaghetti code. This leads to less structured source code. And similar relations can be seen between, for instance, organizational silo and misplaced classes, where again, there's no communication. So those classes tend to end up not where they actually should be, but where they end up being. But I already mentioned gender in the beginning, and I also mentioned diversity in a slightly broader sense. So one might, of course, wonder how diversity is related to this kind of community smells. And a priori, diversity in teams can be both bad and good. So let us start with the upper part of the slide, so with the bad scenarios. In general, people tend to prefer working with others who are similar to them in terms of values, beliefs, and attitudes. And it's very intuitive, because if you already share those values, then it is easier for us to communicate. We don't need to waste time explaining to each other what is important and why do we believe this to be important. We already have this shared background. Moreover, people are coming in formal or semi-formal contexts, and there they tend to be either categorized by the context or categorize themselves into subgroups. I'm seeing this every single time at my university when I'm teaching at the graduate level. If I'm going to give an assignment to groups of students and let students form the groups themselves, I will observe that students who got their undergrad from my university will be working together. Students who got their undergrad from other Dutch universities will be working together, and international students will be working together as well. But those three groups will rarely intermingle. So people who are seen as belonging to the group usually are being treated better than those who do not belong to the group. There is a certain preferential treatment, and if you are familiar with the Harry Potter books, you might recognize the crest in the upper right part of the slide. And if you think about how Gryffindors treat each other as opposed to how they treat Slytherins, that's exactly this in-group.
Alex, just so you know, your audio is getting a little weird.
There's some noise going on. Is my audio?
Okay, I think you caught up now. It just seemed like it was extremely lagged.
Yeah.
Oh, yep, still bad.
Honestly, I don't know where this is coming from. Okay, I can try to start my machine. Hopefully it's better. Just I apologize.
That is okay. Thank you. Alexander, are you still with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, and that sounds significantly better than it did a couple minutes ago.
Okay, so thank you very much. Let us hope that the problem has been solved. If this is not the case, please let me know, and we can try to figure out what's going on.
Yes, we did lose the slides though.
Okay, so I'm going back to the slides, and we are good. Okay, so
no, we don't see the slides still.
Sorry?
We don't see your slides.
You are not seeing the slides. Okay, that's a sec. Share screen. Okay. Do you see
All
the
right, there
slides?
you go. You got them.
Good. Thank you very, very much. And I apologize for the technical inconvenience. So why would be diversity actually good? And this is often related to the notion of resources, because each one of us has their own resources, such as knowledge, skill, social connections, and so on and so forth. If we are very similar, then so are our resources. So essentially, by working together with you, I'm not gaining so much extra compared to the situation when I would be working alone. However, when we are very, very different, then your resources are very different from mine. So by working together, we are sharing them. So you are getting access to my resources, I'm getting access to your resources, and we actually have more. And this leads to the situation when diverse problem solvers outperform high ability problem solvers. And finally, additional benefit of diversity is related to creativity, which is typically associated with creativity into diversity in the cultural context. So in our recent study, we have considered 3 kinds of diversity in GitHub open source teams: gender, geographic distances, and national culture. And of course, there are more kinds of diversity, but we have focused on those 3. So geographic dispersion is merely a standard deviation based on a set of physical distances between community members. When it comes to national culture, then we have used the well-known Hofstede 6D framework. This 6D framework operationalizes national culture as along 6 domains, namely power distance, individualism, collectivism, masculinity, femininity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term versus short-term orientation, and finally indulgence versus restraint.
So let us briefly discuss them. So when it comes to power distance, this is essentially a degree to which less powerful member of the society accept and expect this unequal power distribution. So if you are in a society which exhibits a high level of power distance, then you will be more likely to accept that somebody has more power than you and just take it as part of life. Individualism versus collectivism is related to integration and related to integration into groups. If we have very collectivist society, which would mean that the score is low, this would mean that we are talking about very tight-knit groups. We're talking about situations when individuals can be expected to be taken care of their relatives, but are also expected to take care of their relatives and, of course, other members of the group. Masculinity, femininity is essentially related to stereotypes which are associated, at least in Western culture, with women and men. So masculinity side would be cultures that tend to see as valuable such things as achievement and heroism and assertiveness. And for the feminine societies, we will see preferences for cooperation, caring for weak, quality of life, this kind of things. I will not talk so much about the last three. Instead, I would suggest to consider three countries: China, the Netherlands, and United States. And we are going to look at the first three dimensions of the Hofstede model. So we have power distance, we have individualism and collectivism, and we have femininity and masculinity, right? So we see here that, for instance, Chinese culture scores much higher than the Dutch or the culture of the United States in terms of power distance, meaning that people in China are more likely to accept power disparities in the society. United States has one of the most, if not the most, individualist countries according to this model. Think about Superman, right? A kind of epitome of the culture, at least as we tend to see it. You know, if he's operating alone, he's a man, and so on and so on. And of course, when it comes to masculinity, femininity, the Netherlands is quite exceptional. It scores very low, which means that the Dutch culture is a feminine culture and it favors collaboration as opposed to competition. So this being said, how it all relates to our community smells. So we see here in the middle and on the right, the very same community smells and code smells we have discussed before. And on the left, we see geographic diversity, gender diversity, and some of those national culture elements. So the presence of power distance and individualism is not just by chance. So we actually could not observe a relation between other aspects of the Hofstede model and community smells. I will also not really have time to go through all those arrows. So let us take a look at a couple of them. So first of all, we see that there is a relation between gender diversity and black cloud. So what does this mean? This means that if we have more gender diverse teams, and since we are talking about male dominated domain, more gender diverse teams are simply teams which involve more women, they are less likely to exhibit this kind of black cloud communication problem when you can no longer distinguish between noise and signal. And this is related to the fact that women tend to take this kind of moderating roles and structure communication, successfully reducing the likelihood of black clouds. If you are talking about geographic diversity, then we also see negative relations. So more geographic diverse teams are less likely to exhibit black cloud. So here we believe that the reason for this is that more geographically diverse teams are using tools such as Trello and protocols surrounding those tools. And this actually structures their communication. So indeed, if you have a geographically diverse team, you cannot just put everybody in the same room and let them somehow figure it out. They need much more structured communication, and the structured communication separates useful information from useless information. So most of this work, and in particular the work on diversity and community smells, has been done by means of statistical modeling and archival data analysis. We went to large data sets typically derived from GitHub, looked at how people communicate and looked at how diverse those teams are. But we wanted to understand whether those observations are somehow recognized by developers themselves. And what was even more interesting, we wanted to understand how people would recommend to mitigate those smells, right? Because by only looking at the archival data, we can only see what has already happened. We cannot really see how people would solve the problem when they are being asked to do so. And here we see four box plots, sorry, corresponding to different community smells. And for each one of them, we wanted to understand the importance of gender to mitigate those smells. To contextualize this importance, we have also asked about experience and team size. And you have Likert scale from 1 to 5, meaning that 1 is not important at all, and 5 is very important. So if you just look at those box plots, we see that gender is usually being seen as less relevant to mitigate the presence of the problem than, say, expertise or team size, right? We see that the median for gender is 2 for 2 of our smells for black cloud and silo, and 1 for lone wolves and radio silence, as opposed to other possible variables, which are having as a median 3 or 4. However, taking a closer look at the answers of our survey respondents has provided slightly more refined picture. What was interesting there is that respondents that have scored gender as being more important tend to provide more detailed argumentation. They felt the need to explain why gender is important, as opposed to people who did not consider it to be important. We also have observed that people who scored gender lower tended to have lower experience within diverse teams. And this actually concurs with previous studies from behavioral finance, for instance, that have shown that people tend to minimize the importance of factors they're less knowledgeable about. So we tend to believe that people who have experienced working in more gender diverse teams actually appreciate it much more than those who do not have this kind of experience. When it comes to mitigation, we of course also asked about strategies. Like, okay, you have your community smell, you have this suboptimal communication pattern, how do you deal with it? And it turned out that there are roughly 5 strategies. And they are from left to right: restructuring the community, so essentially bringing new people to the team, kicking people out, and so on; mentoring, creation of a communication plan, monitoring, and cohesion exercise. And what we see here is a kind of so here we see that darker spots correspond to a higher number of respondents. So dark gray are the cells corresponding to 10 respondents or more, light gray between 5 and 9, and white are the rest ones. So indeed, we see that one way to address black clouds, the most popular way to address black cloud would be to create a communication plan, which is hardly surprising because indeed black cloud is all about noise, all about inability to distinguish useful and useless information. So if we can agree upon how do we communicate different kinds of information, then we can solve this. When it comes, for instance, to lone wolves, people proposed either to restructure teams, essentially meaning to remove the wolf or re-involve the wolf somehow, or mentoring, which would be involving discussion with the wolf on how they should communicate and how they should grow in their roles. But of course, one of the elements which we did not consider here was the national culture. And different cultures can treat this kind of communication patterns in different ways. So this is why we have replicated our study with 184 Brazilian software developers coming from different regions of Brazil. And here on the slides, I overlaid the very same picture we have seen before with colors corresponding to the original study of Catalina et al. With numbers which we have obtained from the study in Brazil. And I have only kept strategies that have got at least 10 votes. So we see that indeed for, in many cases, there is an agreement between the two studies. For instance, black cloud can be held by creating a communication strategy, but also by restructuring teams. And for lone wolves, we have restructuring teams and mentoring. For radio silence, we did not observe this agreement. Our original study respondents believe that mentoring and cohesion exercises are the way to go, while the Brazilian respondents prefer to restructure the teams. We need to look further into those differences. We actually have not figured out so far what could be responsible for this kind of disagreement. Good. So in the second part of the talk, I would like to move on and discuss how we obtain this kind of results. Essentially moving from the what to the how and opening the black box. The reason I'm doing it is because I love this kind of topics, and I'm very curious to see how this kind of topics work in the research software engineering. So I'm trying to somehow convince you to join this kind of research and maybe to use some of the technologies I'm going to talk about next in your own work. So typically, our research involves doing two things. So we are analyzing large amount of data, archival data. This process is known as mining software repositories. Very often this data is coming from GitHub. It is often coming from Stack Overflow, but in general, it can be version control, it can be mail archive, it can be issue tracker, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we like talking to people. So in most of the studies I refer to, we had either interviews or surveys or a combination of the two, simply because by observing the history as it has taken so far, we can only know what has happened, but we cannot really know why it happened. Neither we can know how people would respond to this kind of challenges in the future. So let us start with a simpler thing. So when it comes to community smells, we have three techniques which are based on repository mining. Code Face for Smells was the original one by Damien Tamburi himself. And it has been recently replaced by Kayaulu, coming from Hawaii. And then there is also an independent tool known as CS Detector. So if you want to study community smells, those are the tools you can use. But of course, on the human side, we need to figure out how to ask about community smells. So we don't really want to ask people, did you ever encounter lone wolves? Because then we need to explain what lone wolves are. And instead we used vignettes. So essentially we have used small stories, such as the one on the slide, and asked developers to read this text and respond whether they recognize it. And if yes, how likely is it that, for instance, this kind of community smell will emerge in their company or in their team, or how likely is this kind of community smell going to be associated with some kind of problems at the source code level. So this is a typical way of asking about community smells. We have done it in the survey with Brazilians, we have done it in survey with in another project, and so on and so forth. But of course, theirs was the easy part when we talked about community smells. Inferring gender from whatever data we might have might be quite challenging. And we need to remember that gender is a complex social construct, and any kind of automated detection and any kind of questions we might be asking will make simplifying assumptions. And those simplifying assumptions should be, we should be aware of those simplifying assumptions and their possible influence on our research. On top of all this, gender is, of course, privacy sensitive. If you're talking about open source contributors, some of them might prefer to hide their gender on purpose. For example, some women developers prefer not to disclose their gender due to safety concerns. Beyond that, when we are moving to the level of a project or to the level of an organization, some of those projects and organizations simply do not want us to know genders of their members. For example, because they are afraid that they might be less gender diverse than they would like to look like. So let us start with asking about gender from the survey perspective or interview perspective. So in 2004, Brad Byrne and his co-authors have published a quite influential guide. They're calling it the definitive guide, but it's definitely an influential guide, the questionnaire designed for political polls, market research, and social and health questionnaires. And when it comes to gender, then the question is, what is your sex, or what is names sex? And there are two options, male and female. So we already see that this question is conflating gender and sex, and that it also reduces it to two boxes. But of course, this is not realistic. If you look at the most recent survey of Stack Overflow, we see that more than 1.4% of the respondents identify as non-binary, genderqueer, or gender non-conforming, and almost another 1% prefer to self-describe, essentially suggesting that we are roughly around 2.3% of respondents who are not going to fit into those two boxes of Brad Byrne. And this is, of course, not only Stack Overflow. A recent survey by Linux Foundation reported 4% of non-binary respondents. So whatever instrument you are going to use, whatever question you are going to ask, it should provide means of expressing genders which are beyond women and men. Here we see one of the first suggestions to this instrument, namely suggestion by Greta Bauer. And the question was as follows: are you 1 male, 2 female, 3 something else specified? So unfortunately, this is also a problematic solution, because what we see here, we see a clear preference of the author expressed in male and female, as opposed to, something else. So this phenomenon is known as othering, which is a way of expressing preference. On top of this not really being nice towards non-binary respondents, this question turned out to be non-reliable. So what we see here are the results of trans feminine and trans masculine respondents answering this question. So we see essentially that the answers are all over the place. And the reason is very simple. When this instrument was used in a survey, respondents tried to figure out what did the author of the survey actually want to hear. Was it about birth assigned sex? Was it about gender identity? And they've been reaching different conclusions and giving different answers. And on top of it, when this very same item has been used in an interview setting, then respondents have indicated, the interviewees have indicated that this question was taxing, because again, they try to figure out what did the interviewer want to hear, and it was putting them in a very uncomfortable position. And of course, this is exactly what you want to avoid when you're interviewing people. So since then, much more refined categories have been proposed. This is, for instance, a list from Open Demographics. So you see here quite some positive elements. For instance, being not being transgender is considered separate from gender identity. You see this nice phrasing, where do you identify on the gender spectrum? Check all that apply, because it suggests that a person can be, for instance, a woman and a non-binary at the same time. So it's check all that apply. And of course, this reference to gender spectrum. The problematic nature of this is that essentially there are many options. So unless you are studying gender non-conforming people, this question itself might confuse. And ultimately, when we are asking about gender, we are typically not asking about gender because it's the sole focus of the study, but because we want to relate it to something else. For instance, to our community smells, or to experiences, or to anything else in the software engineering context. So ultimately, when it comes to the survey, the HCI guidelines for gender equity and inclusivity simply suggest to ask an open question. And this might be a little bit more difficult for us, because as researchers, we'll need to process this data, we'll need to code this data, and there is always a risk of vandalism when people essentially writing random letters or Apache helicopter and so on in this kind of survey instruments. But at the same time, most of software engineering surveys I have seen are relatively small, leading to maybe 100, maybe 150 answers if you are optimistic. And most of those answers will indicate gender as being women or men. So essentially, the coding effort does not cannot be used as an excuse to not ask this kind of open questions. However, whatever survey techniques we use and whatever questions we ask, there is a big problem. And this problem is response rate. Software engineering surveys tend to reach low response rates. Anything between 10 and 20% is nowadays being seen as good. And I also seen surveys where response rate is in single figures. It is partially related to the fact that the very same people are being repeatedly surveyed and over-surveyed, right? Think about GitHub contributors working on popular Java projects, right? It's one of the favorite kinds of data that people like I like to study. And then, of course, if you want to survey them, you're going to survey the same people over and over again. To make it even worse, typically surveys are combined with analysis of the archival data. So numbers like 60,000 individuals are no exception if you're analyzing archival data. And it's great because then we can tease out very fine-grained statistical effects, right? I mean, we have a lot of data. But of course, if you want to get gender of those 60,000 individuals, and we have a 10% response rate, then we need to send 600,000 invitations. And if I'm going to send 600,000 invitations and somebody else is going to send 600,000 invitations to the very same GitHub respondents, then they will simply be fed up with us even faster. So this is why all kinds of automatic gender detection mechanisms have been proposed. So essentially a way of deriving gender information from whatever information is already there. And the basic assumption of all those techniques is that self-presentation through choice of usernames, through choice of profile picture, and artifacts created such as source code and comments can be used to infer gender. So if you do not believe in these assumptions, and all those tools are not for you. And it's a dangerous assumption. There are people who will even be claiming that it's a violent assumption, but this is an assumption which allows one to scale and go beyond a couple of hundreds of respondents to thousands and tens of thousands of data points. So roughly speaking, when it comes to tools, and I can give a separate talk only about those tools, there are three categories. It is name to gender, face to gender, and artifact to gender. The name to gender is associated with established traditions of associating certain names with specific genders within a certain culture. This cultural element is important because, of course, we have names such as Andrea, which will be typically associated with men in Italy and, for instance, with women in Germany. So this is why this kind of name to gender tools tend to take some kind of cultural background into account, either deriving it from the location, which is, of course, very problematic for immigrants, for second generation, and so on, or based on interpretation of the surnames, right? I mean, if your name happens to be Donatelli, then you're probably Italian, and then having your first name Andrea, you might be more likely, you are more likely to be a man than a woman. The second group of approaches are based on facial recognition. Facial recognition is, of course, controversial, both at the level of applications and quite at the level of theories. This being said, numerous tools exist. At least yesterday, after a couple of minutes of searching, I have found 5 different ones which allow you to upload your picture or even take control of your camera, and they try to infer your gender and your age based on, for instance, bone structure and so on and so on. Again, this works to some extent, but can be problematic through a reliability lens. For instance, if I would be wearing dark glasses, then my gender might not be identifiable, lighting, and so on and so forth. And the last group of approaches is based on the idea that whoever we are is expressed in texts we write. So usually this kind of observations are made for personal writing, such as blogs or novels. But there is some work which also shows that there are differences in how people of different genders write code. So this being said, those automatic approaches are, of course, beneficial because indeed they allow us to scale up, but they have their limitations. And the first limitation, and obvious limitation, is accuracy. So when it comes to names, the study of Sophie Chu has shown that for different kinds of names, accuracy balances between 60% and 84%. And for Western names, accuracy tends to be higher than for Eastern names. So if you're working in international context, then we see clear disbalance there. Kruger and Herman have surveyed artifact to gender approaches, so textual-based approaches, and also their accuracy is between 60 and 90%. For it is mostly about text like Twitter messages and so on. For source code, examples of accuracy are somewhere in the 70%. So the next concern would be reliability, right? This is a quote from one of the surveys we have conducted quite some time ago. And the person has indicated that her normal GitHub handle was her first name, which is a distinctly female name. And she has decided to use a fake GitHub handle so that people would assume that she was a man. And essentially, this triggers two questions. First of all, if our tools would be able to identify this person as a woman despite this GitHub handle being trying to protect her, is it even ethical? And the second question is, of course, you know, the results are simply not reliable because the tool might assume, together with other GitHub people, that this person is a man, but actually it is a woman. The next group of problems is related to gender binary. So all the tools we have are related to gender binary. So textual tools only think about women and men. Face recognition think only about women and men. Names are a bit more tricky here because tools which are based on names tend to provide score on a range between -1 and 1 or between 0 and 1. But this doesn't, with the extremes corresponding, for instance, to women and men. But this doesn't mean that those tools are aware of non-binary genders. This simply means that those scores correspond to degree of certainty. So for instance, if a tool gives -1, if it is completely sure that the person is a man, and 1, if the tool is completely sure that it's a woman, then 0 will simply mean that the tool does not know, and 0.5 will mean that the tool suspects that this person is a woman, but is not very, very sure. So this conflation of confidence and actual scores leads to the fact that those name-based tools create kind of go away from gender binary, but essentially they do not. Okay, very briefly, I will touch on the topic of national culture. We talked about it in the beginning. And specifically, the concept of national culture is again highly complicated one. I already mentioned immigrants, different subgroups within the society, second generation, and so on and so forth. And whatever happens with our tools will be approximate. So here we see my profile from GitHub, I think. It indicates the Netherlands for my culture, or actually for my country, which is problematic because, of course, it's not, it's a location where I work, but it's not a country where I live. It's not the nationality I have. It's not the place where I've been born, and so on and so forth. So it has certain reasons. I mean, I have certain reasons why I'm indicating this country in particular. But in different contexts, I might have indicated a different one or different countries, plural. And this would essentially mean that you cannot just take geographic location as a proxy for national culture, let alone that it would imply that all people living in this country have the very same culture, which is a problematic assumption. The reason actually why I'm showing my profile rather than profile of somebody else is related to consent, right? I mean, it was very, very easy for me to provide consent to share my data as opposed to somebody else's. Oh yes, and of course, platforms such as Stack Overflow do not force this kind of location information. Roughly 25% of Stack Overflow users provide any kind of information as their location, and this location is not always reliable. I mean, think about the null, also drop from the sun, and so on and so on. So, as already mentioned, a more refined approach has been implemented in the tools such as NumSOAR. They're trying to look at the infer country of residence based on the last name. So here we see more refined responses, and in my case, they're coming closer to reality. But of course, it's all based on the premise that names can be split into first names and last names, or at least there is a part of a full name which can be labeled as the last name, which is of course not necessarily true, because you have cultures where names are mononymic, so essentially there is no surname, like there's one thing which is the name. There are countries and lots of cultures where there are multiple surnames. Names might be used in different circumstances, in different ways, and so on and so forth. So again, this would typically work quite well for Western names, but not necessarily so once we're working in the international context and have to take into account cultural differences. So essentially, in the second part of the talk, we discussed two large groups of techniques identifying contributors, gender and national culture, by asking questions and applying algorithmic tools. So none of those techniques is perfect. Questionnaires simply do not scale. And even the very best questions do not necessarily capture what you actually want to hear, but they are coming probably as close as possible to reliable ways of getting this information. Algorithmic tools, of course, scale. This is their primary benefit, but they make all kinds of simplifying assumptions, such as gender binary, or such. They can be just inaccurate because of the heuristics they are using. And of course, the choice of the technique should be done in function of the research question. And it might be equally important as researchers for us to reflect on the limitations of those tools, and not only on the benefits, which actually made us choose them in the first place. So to summarize, what have we been talking about today? By combining large-scale archival data analysis, also known as repository mining, and talking to people by means of surveys and interviews, we have identified relations between diversity variables, community smells, those suboptimal communication patterns, and code smells, which are suboptimal ways of organizing source code. At the same time, techniques we are using risk oversimplification, and which might threaten validity of our results. This means that we need to be more careful in our studies. This means that we need further studies, and given this community, of course, we need further studies targeting research software engineers, because we really don't know so much about them. And I would be more than happy to explore this community, to learn about this community together with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Alexander, that was a lovely talk. All right, we have a few minutes left for questions or for comments if anybody wants to raise their hand and something, or also we can give a virtual clap. Thank you very much. All right, so anybody want to ask any questions of Alexander or start any conversations in the last few minutes that we have? I'll add the note that every time I hear that 600,000 number, I just cringe. It's just such a large number.
the ridiculous point here is that it's not so large, because if you are thinking about millions and millions of people working on GitHub repositories, you can get this kind of numbers. You can send 600,000 invitations. Technically speaking, it's not a problem at all. It's just that it doesn't work. And the idea of not oversampling, not oversurveying people, which seems to be more or less established in psychology, came as a major surprise for empirical software engineering researchers. And by now we have a problem of well, do I dare to call it overfishing? Essentially over-surveying people, and ultimately people do not respond, the response rates go down. And when we are getting responses, it's very difficult to be sure whether people whom we are actually surveying are those whom we want to survey, because ideally we want to have experienced people who have ideas what they're talking about and so on. At the most recent international conference on software engineering, we had a very nice workshop on recruitment of participants for empirical studies, ropes. All kinds of techniques are currently being used. For instance, people are trying to go on Prolific, which is a platform for surveys. Essentially, you are paying money, and the organization promises you to bring so many respondents. The problem there is that people are answering this kind of surveys en masse to get money. This means that you need to ask all kinds of screening questions to be sure that people who respond to your questions actually are professionals, or at least have some idea of what they're talking about. But this is also not an easy thing. And in particular, when you are moving beyond, the very basic programming questions to more advanced questions, such as, the questions I've been talking about here with those vignettes, right? You really need to have experience with software development projects to be able to answer them. So yes.
So I know that I have a little bit of meta knowledge on this, and I apologize, but I know that you and Reed Malevich released a survey for one study that you're doing, and one of the kind of incentivization elements that you put into it was, we'll donate, $1 to some foundation of your choice. Did that help with your return rate at all?
Well, yes and no. The point here is that this is an open survey, right? So we are just distributing it to as many people as we can, and essentially response rate cannot even be computed. We got reasonable number of responses, but of course we would love to have even more. In a sense, the number of responses we have now allows us to infer some meaningful conclusions. So this is in sense of reasonable number of responses. Sorry, we got 65. Of course, it would be lovely to get more.
So that's the plug, everybody. We should all respond to Alexander's survey.
Yeah, I will send Miranda the link, and you are very, very welcome to share it with your colleagues, because we are looking not at software developers in this survey, but at people developing software, which is not exactly the same. But we are interested actually in everybody who is developing software. So yes, what was nice with this kind of initiatives of donating $1 to open source foundations is that we got positive feedback. So people who are responding and people who are sharing seem to appreciate it. But can it be translated to increase in the number of responses? That's a big question.
We have one question if you have a little bit more time, Alexander.
Yes.
I'll read it out loud just for benefit of the recording. Can we apply the refactoring strategies to our own software work groups? As in, will these work for software groups other than open source communities?
It's a good question. Probably as a scientist, I should say, I don't know. in a sense that the responses we got from surveys have been coming from all kinds of groups, not only open source, but also commercial. So apparently people are knowing what they're talking about. But the reason why I'm saying I don't know, because of course I did not observe it in a specific project, in a specific context. This was my intervention, and this is the outcome. But as a person who believes in the importance of communication, I should probably say yes, because I don't see any reason why they should not.
Well, thank you again, Alexander, for joining us. This concludes this installation of the DEI Speaker Series, the USRSC DEI Speaker Series. This was recorded. It will be posted on our USRSC YouTube later once it has been rendered and appropriately whatever technology. Thank you so much again, Alexander. We really appreciate your time here. This was a great talk. And we look forward, or at least I look forward to reading more of your fabulous papers about, especially about diversity and equity and inclusion topics in open science.
Thank you very much, Miranda, for inviting me. It has been a great pleasure for me to talk to you, and feel free to reach out to me whenever you have any questions related to those topics. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.